thought I'd share my lunch with you. Well, sort of. I'll show you how I made this. It's smoked bacon with apples and onions. It's based on a traditional Danish recipe. And it's a big pleaser at reenactment events. It's high energy. The apples keep your blood sugar up. And the bacon gives you animal fats to keep you warm on a cold winter's day. So, to the kitchen, and I'll show you how I made it. So what you need for this recipe is 4 to 4, 5, 6 medium-sized apples. These ones are Empires, but if memory serves correctly, Macintosh works the best for cooking. But any apple that you like will work perfectly fine. And it's a good idea to wash your apples before you use them because you're keeping the peels on. You'll need 2 or 3 large onions. In this case, I only really had medium-sized onions, so I'm throwing in a third smaller one. And about a pound of bacon. If you're doing it at a reenactment event, the bacon that you should use is probably going to be back bacon. It looks a little nicer. Looks a little more period than the pre-sliced stuff. But if you're making it at home, this will do perfectly fine. So what you're going to want to do is chop everything up into fairly small pieces, and with the apples it helps if you cut just to the side of the core in each of the planes, and then you don't have to contend with little bits of core and stuff in your food. And then you probably want to just chop this in half, and then about that size. So it's basically just that, and normal kitchen safety things apply, right? You just you don't really want to accidentally cut your fingers or anything like that. You want to wash your hands. You want to make sure that you cut the meat last so that you're not cutting meat and then vegetables. And you want to wash all surfaces so everything's nice and tidy, so you don't get anybody sick or anything like that. So, just chopping the rest of these. Now this dish probably was a dish served in the fall while the apples were still fresh, because at the time they didn't have refrigeration to keep the apples fresh like they do now. Because now you can have apples that have been sitting in the fridge at the orchards for all winter, whereas back then they didn't really have that kind of preservation techniques. So now basically what you want to do is sort of cut the onions into about the same size as the apples, so that everything sort of cooks at a similar rate. You can go a little bit thinner. And one technique that I have found for chopping onions very quickly is to actually leave this end on, sort of the hairy root end of it, and then cut towards it, and then just chopping like that, and then using the breaks in the thing as sort of dicing. So you can sort of quickly cut these onions before you really get affected by the sulfur in them. And one thing I find is that if you have a very sharp knife, that you're less likely to be affected by the sulfur because there isn't as much produced. It's mostly produced when the little capillaries and stuff inside the onion get broken. And with a sharp knife, it cuts through them cleanly instead of breaking them. Looks like I'm going to need a bigger pot. So next you want to cut your bacon into little strips, little chunks. I actually find that this is a little bit easier if the bacon is partially frozen. But it's fully thawed, so. Just cutting it into little chunks, roughly 3/4 of an inch to an inch long. So I'm throwing them directly into the pan that it'll be cooked in. And basically what you're going to do is cook the bacon and then pull it out and let it sort of drain a little bit, and then cook the apples and everything in the bacon fat. And you know, sometimes bigger chunks are all right, especially if they're fattier, because that's the section that a lot of the fat will render out of, creating just a little more fluid for the apples, as well as the fatty parts, the parts that are going to shrink a lot too. And sometimes just tearing it apart is just as easy as cutting it, or easier. So now that everything's cut, it's time to clean up this mess and then start cooking. And just a little bit of a note, the pan that you're using to cook this, you're probably going to want it to have a lid, so that you can close it later to cook the apples and onions. But if you don't have a lid, you can always set a plate or a metal tray on top of it. And that'll help keep in some of the moisture and stuff. So, what I generally do is to cook bacon, just like you normally do for cooking breakfast. I sort of just put it on medium heat and let it go. It shouldn't take very long to cook, so I will skip ahead. So your bacon doesn't have to be crispy, it just has to be cooked all the way through. So I'm pretty content with it there. Now modern tastes and everything would say drain the bacon on a piece of paper towel or something to get some of the fat out of it, some of the grease out of it. But our ancestors, especially in the cold fall and winter months, and early spring and everything, their bodies craved animal fats, because in a northern climate you really need animal fats to be able to keep warm. When you're outside in all that weather and everything, and even your house might not necessarily be that warm, your body needs the animal fats to be able to produce enough energy to keep you warm. It's just hard in northern climates to have a healthy diet, let's say, at least by modern standards. Not to say that their diet was unhealthy, it just had a lot more animal fats and everything in it than we have now. So I'm just going to throw this in a pot, not even bothering draining it, because a lot of the flavor is in that bacon grease. And I know from experience, doing a show in the middle of the winter, having something with a little bit of bacon in it that still has all the drippings and everything definitely helped keep me warm and keep my energy levels up. Just trying to get as much of that out of the pan as possible. I'm going to turn the heat down just a little bit. On this stove it's a 4. The bacon was cooking at a 5. So I'm going to set the bacon aside and dump in my apple-onion mix. Some people like to saute the onions first. With the amount of time that this is going to have to cook, and the fact that it's basically being steamed, I don't think it's going to make too much of a difference. The onions might come out a little bit crisper that way, but that's about it. Now just give them a nice stir to kind of make sure that nothing's really stuck to the pan at the moment. And then basically they cook for, you put the lid on, and it cooks for about 10 minutes just as is. You know, you stir every once in a while excuse me, to make sure everything's cooking evenly and nothing's stuck to the pan. So that's that for the next 10 minutes. So now that it's cooked for about 10 minutes, and everything's cooked well through, the onions have kind of gone somewhat translucent, and your apples have gone soft, and a lot of juices have been released from the vegetables and fruit. Now what you want to do is add your bacon back in, and then stir it in. Try to get as much of the drippings from it back in it as possible, because that's all flavor. And then you stir it in just to kind of get it all evenly in there. Put your lid back on it and let that cook for another 5 minutes. So now that the bacon's heated all the way through, you're ready to serve it. One thing that I know tastes really good on it is fresh ground pepper. So you add a bit of a sprinkle to the top of it and stir that in. If you're doing this at an event, it's probably a good idea to have a little pot of pepper already ground, unless you have some kind of a period mortar and pestle. Other than that, I don't think it'll need any salt, because the bacon has quite a lot of salt in it already. And that's about it for this recipe. You can add whatever spices and herbs you want to it that fall within things that the Norse would have had at that time. So basically this can be made very easily over a fire in a traditional pot. Most of it's just over a medium heat. And then it can be kept all day, just sitting there sort of simmering along, adding a little bit of water every now and again just to keep the moisture level up. But you just keep it sitting there over a low heat, and it'll keep all day, and everybody will be nice and happy to be able to get a scoop of this after a fight, or when they start to feel cold, they can warm up with this and a little cup of pine needle tea or some herbal tea. And it's a very tasty recipe. So I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for watching.